What I've done here is to work ahead, and I'm showing you how I figure out where the beads are supposed to be and what kind they are. I generally go shopping for the beads. What I mean by go shopping is look in my stash and pull things out to see what lives together and what seems to want to work with on this project. So you can have either your bolt of trim, you could have a thick pad, whatever. But what I like to do is to pin all of the beads in place. And you can pin them in successive waves. This will be the first pass when I'm sewing the beads, and I'll show you when I have it all sewn down, and then I will decide subsequent passes of beads. It doesn't all have to go on at once. You can put one kind of thing on, study it, decide, okay, does it need more? Then you can put more on. But the point is you can compose this and pin it together and get a sense of what it's going to do and what it's going to look like before you commit to sewing it down. So I'm going to go off camera and sew these, and I'm going to put the tutorial about running stitches and stop stitches, because the running stitch and the stop stitch are really the two stitches that I use most when sewing beads down in this particular method. So while you're enjoying those tutorials, I will go off camera and do some work. The next one is the stop stitch. The stop stitch is used on beads or sequins, so I'm going to demonstrate it with both. So let's just say you have a large bead that you want to sew down, this being the large bead. The way that you would sew it with the stop stitch, we're looking at it from the side view, is you're going to come in and you're going to thread the large bead and a small seed bead, which I call the stop, onto the thread. From there, you're going to bring the needle back and through the fabric, and then you're going to pull. And when you pull, what you're going to have is something that looks like this. You'll have the little bead here I call the stop bead, and it sits on top of the larger bead. If you're working with the sequin, this is the cross section of the sequin, it'll look something like that. So this is the basic stop stitch. Now this little sweater from earlier, you recognize her. This had the little flowers. These sequins are all sewn with the stop stitch. Now you can see the little beads. That is what I refer to as a stop bead. So when you hear me say that, that's what I'm talking about. So this is a good example of the stop stitch. Since you got to see sequins on the stop stitch in the little sweater, I will demonstrate on the sequins first and then on the round beads. It's a simple matter of just coming up through the fabric and picking up the sequin in this case. And you slide that down onto the fabric. Then you pick up a seed bead. Now, this is a memory trick. What I like to do when I'm making the stop stitch is I hold the stop bead, as I call it, on my finger and then put the needle back into the hole. That way I don't make the mistake of actually forgetting to sew the stop bead separately. I'm going to zoom in now, bring this down a little bit here, and I'll zoom in here. So I'll sew 2 or 3 more just for fun. So we have the sequin, pick up the stop bead, and the stop bead, of course, is on my finger, and we go back down through the sequin. So now that you've seen it in operation with the sequin, I will sew a couple of round beads. So the round beads put down the bead. Again, you pick up your stop bead and go back into the fabric. So that is the basic stop stitch. And here you can see I have sewn the beads that I pinned down, and I sewed this with a stop stitch. I'm feeling like it needs a little more, so I'm going to study it and sew some more beads and finish it up, and I will bring it back to you here. The next stitch is the running stitch. Now in hand sewing, the running stitch does this as opposed to the back stitch, which is doing this. So I like to group the stitches in different, what I call concepts. The back stitch was one concept, the running stitch is another. So the easy way of sewing a running stitch, you secure your thread, of course, and then you pick up your bead and you stitch into the fabric. Then you travel underneath the fabric, pick up your bead, and continue. The idea of stitch length being either the same length as the bead or slightly longer applies here as well. Now this distance between the two stitches, between where you go in and where you emerge, that can be as tiny as 1 or 2 millimeters, or that can be several inches. But the stitch is the same. You're coming out and going back in. The drawback of this stitch, though, as opposed to a back stitch is very secure, so if you break a thread, it's going to take a while for it to unravel. The running stitch, not so much. So you have to consider what you're doing with the running stitch, what kind of use it is going to receive. But this is the running stitch. You can have single beads on a stitch, or you can have multiple beads on a stitch. Works the same way. Running stitch. We're starting a new stitch pattern. This stitch pattern is called the running stitch. You're familiar with a running stitch in hand sewing. It operates the same way here, except you're just going to be sewing on beads. I've marked out a line, and I'm going to be sewing a few running stitches with single beads to demonstrate the process. When you're sewing, I'm going to use the seed beads first. As before, stitch length is the same length of the bead or slightly longer. And the distance between where you enter and exit the fabric can be just right next to the bead, or you can space quite a ways from the bead. That is dependent on the particular design you're working with. So you can see here the stitch length onto the fabric is just a couple yarns of the muslin. So I'm going to sew 3 or 4 more, and then I'm going to sew multiple beads on a running stitch so you can see that. In the background, you can hear the buzzsaw. Again, this is sewing Cinema Verite from my studio here in New York. Okay, now I'm going to sew multiple beads on a stitch with the running stitch, and that's what this is going to look like. And again, as with the back stitch, you can make the stitch length on multiple beads shorter or longer. That really depends on the texture you're wanting to create. So here's some multiple beads on a stitch. So now also you can stitch further apart. Like the scatter pattern, which I will be showing you. If you have, you can mark a scatter pattern. Now, when I'm making a randomly spaced scatter pattern, I work in groups of 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So these are uneven pentagons, really. And there's something about working in uneven pentagons that after you've filled a space, it just reads as an even spacing. I don't quite know why that works, I just know it does. So each one of these stitches then would be one bead, and you would carry the thread underneath. Now, if I'm going to be making something where you have a running stitch sewing quite a number of these beads, one thing I would try to do whenever possible is secure the thread after every so many. Generally it's after every 5 or 6, because you have quite a lot of thread and the running stitch is not quite as strong as the back stitch. So if you break a thread, there is a greater likelihood that this stitch will come unraveled. So I'm just going to say here's 5. So as a rule, I don't like to knot off into the fabric, but in this particular case, you have a workaround. You can just come up underneath the bead and stitch down 2 or 3 times. You don't have to break your thread, but having the bead sit over where you've tied off is going to hide it, and then you can continue sewing. So here, as you can see, I'm not going to make you watch me sew this whole thing here. I'll go off camera. But as you can see, you just continue on, and you don't have to proceed in any particular way. That is entirely up to you. Having the fabric under tension will ensure that you have a proper thread tension and it won't pucker your fabric. Here we are. I've added some more beads, as you can see, in that area. Now, one thing I like to do is to have round beads and flat surface beads in a composition, because you can see the flat surface beads make a little flash of light, so it gives it some life. Now I want to finish off these ends here, so I will take this again back off camera and work some magic and bring it back. So here we are with our finished sample. You can see here, I like some sort of device to camouflage where the cords go into the fabric. And I think a dangle is quite a nice little detail. Now, something to know here. The entire garment section, or piece, is interlined with the flannel, or the felt. If this were, say, a pocket, or it was a small detail on a larger garment section, what you would do after you've worked your magic here is to turn it over and trim close. Now this is something, yeah, if you interline an entire garment in these fabrics, it'll be stiff as a board, and you'll end up wearing something that's like a cardboard box. So you trim off the felt close to the stitches. And that way you still have the support in the fabric where you need it, but you don't have any excess hanging around where you don't. So yes, if you were making something like the dinner jackets I've shown in the videos, the pockets have just the embellishment sections underlined with the felt. The lapels would have the entire lapel underlined with the felt. So here we have Passementerie. This series of photos gives you a little idea of the process of using this kind of embellishment. As you can see in the first photo of the cape is partially constructed, some of the beadwork is sewn, and then the passementerie is put onto the front. So the first photo has just the trim itself pinned down, ready to stitch. The second photo is everything finished and finalized. The facing, the collar facing, is in the next couple of photos, and the facing itself was interlined with the wool felt all the way through. And once all the pieces were finished, then it was sewn into a finished garment. I thought it was rather successful. It turned out very well. It was quite weighty, but quite beautiful. Thank you for joining me for this particular class. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed it.